In 1856, a traveling daguerreotypist captured what appeared to be an ordinary Sunday gathering at St. Augustine's Chapel in rural Alabama. 89 enslaved people stood arranged in careful rows before the whitewashed church, their faces frozen in time by the primitive photographic process. The image was filed away in a plantation archive, forgotten for over a century. When historians at the Alabama State Archives finally examined the photograph in 2018, they noticed something impossible. At least 17 faces in that congregation belonged to people who had already been declared dead in official plantation records. Some had been listed as deceased months before the photograph was taken. Others had supposedly died years earlier. Their burials recorded in church ledgers and estate documents. The discovery triggered an investigation that would unravel one of the most disturbing conspiracies in American slavery history. A systematic program of identity erasure, forced disappearances, and document falsification that allowed a network of plantation owners to traffic enslaved people between states while evading both legal restrictions and moral accountability. The photograph became known as the Phantom Congregation, a single frozen moment that exposed decades of carefully orchestrated lies. Behind those 89 faces lay a web of forged death certificates, secretnishnik transfers, and mass graves that authorities had deliberately ignored. The silence surrounding this case lasted 162 years, protected by destroyed records, intimidated witnesses, and a legal system designed to look away. This is the story of how one photograph brought the dead back to life and revealed that sometimes the living are the ones who truly vanish. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. Capítulo 1. The Discovery. The photograph arrived at the Alabama State Archives in a deteriorating leather portfolio, donated by the estate of Margaret Whitfield Chen, a descendant of the prominent Whitfield plantation family. Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, a specialist in antebellum photography, was cataloguing the collection when she found the daguerreotype wrapped in yellowed newspaper from 1856. At first glance, it seemed unremarkable, another document of the brutal institution that had defined the South. 89 black faces stared into the camera with expressions ranging from solemn dignity to barely concealed fear. The composition was formal, almost rigid, with the congregation arranged in precise rows before a simple wooden church. But something troubled Dr. Okonkwo. The faces seemed hauntingly familiar. She had spent years studying plantation records from the Whitfield estate and surrounding properties, memorizing names and approximate ages from ledgers and bills of sale. Several faces in the photograph matched descriptions from those documents, but the dates didn't align. She began cross-referencing systematically, matching estimated ages and physical descriptions from the photograph with documented individuals from Whitfield plantation records. The first match came quickly. A woman in the third row, approximately 40 years old, with distinctive scarring on her left cheek, matched the description of Patience Drummond, a woman whose death had been recorded in the plantation ledger on February 3, 1856, 4 months before the photograph's date stamp of June 15th. Dr. Okonkwo felt her pulse quicken. It could be a coincidence, a mistake in the records, or simply someone who resembled the description. But then she found another match, and another. By the end of the week, she had identified 17 individuals in the photograph who appeared in death records dated before the image was captured. The implications were staggering. Either the plantation records were fraudulent or something far more sinister had occurred. Death certificates in the antebellum South were legal documents that could absolve owners of responsibility, terminate insurance claims, and most importantly, erase people from official existence, making them invisible to census takers, tax collectors, and anyone who might ask questions. Dr. Okonkwo reached out to colleagues at university archives across the South, sharing her findings. Within days, a network of historians began pulling records from courthouses, churches, and private collections. What they discovered would take years to fully document, but the pattern became clear almost immediately. The Phantom Congregation was not an isolated incident, but evidence of a systematic operation that had functioned for decades. Capítulo 2. The Whitfield Network. The Whitfield family had operated their cotton plantation in the Black Belt region of Alabama since 1819. By the 1840s, they controlled over 3,000 acres and held approximately 180 enslaved people in bondage. Marcus Whitfield, the patriarch who commissioned the 1856 photograph, was known in local society as a devout Methodist and vocal proponent of Christian slavery, the paternalistic ideology that framed enslavement as a civilizing mission. But beneath the veneer of religious piety, Marcus Whitfield ran a sophisticated criminal enterprise. Historians discovered that he maintained two sets of ledgers: the official plantation records filed with county authorities, and a private accounting book written in a cipher that took cryptographers nearly 2 years to decode. The cipher revealed a network of at least 7 plantation owners across Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia who collaborated in what they called the transfer system. When enslaved people became too rebellious, too educated, or simply too visible, perhaps because local abolitionists had documented their existence, they would be declared dead in official records. Forged death certificates, signed by a complicit doctor, would be filed with county clerks. The deceased individuals would then be secretly transported to another plantation in the network, often hundreds of miles away, where they would be registered under new names and different ages. Their previous identities were erased. Family members left behind were told their loved ones had died of illness or accident. Some were even shown fabricated grave markers. The system served multiple purposes. It allowed owners to evade the interstate slave trade restrictions that some states had implemented. It provided a method to separate families without the public spectacle of slave auctions. Most chillingly, it created a population of people who officially did not exist, individuals who could be worked to death, abused, or disposed of without any legal accountability. Marcus Whitfield's private ledger contained detailed records of 127 people who had been transferred between 1842 and 1861. The entries were coldly businesslike. Hannah, age 24, field hand, rebellious spirit, transferred to Caldwell, Mississippi, June 1849, officially deceased, cholera. The 1856 photograph appeared to be a deliberate act of documentation by Whitfield himself, perhaps insurance against his partners, or simply the arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable. He had gathered individuals from across the network for what he recorded in his ledger as a demonstration of our Christian ministry to African souls, a staged religious service that inadvertently captured evidence of his crimes. Capítulo 3. The dead who walk now. I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. Among the 17 deceased individuals identified in the photograph, 3 cases particularly haunted the research team. Their stories, pieced together from fragments of evidence, revealed the human cost of the transfer system. Samuel Booker had been born on the Whitfield plantation in 1821. Plantation records described him as literate, dangerously intelligent. In 1848, at age 27, he was caught teaching other enslaved people to read using a Bible he had hidden in the barn. Marcus Whitfield recorded his punishment in the official ledger. Samuel Booker, deceased October 12, 1848, complications from fever. But Samuel Booker stood in the third row of the 1856 photograph, clearly alive 8 years after his supposed death. The cipher ledger revealed he had been transferred to a plantation in Natchez, Mississippi, where he was registered as Moses Carter, age 19, field hand. His wife and 2 children at Whitfield Plantation were never told the truth. They mourned him for the rest of their lives. Esther Williams, a skilled midwife who had delivered over 60 children on the plantation, was declared dead in January 1854 after she attempted to flee. The official record stated she had drowned crossing a swollen creek during her escape attempt. Her body was supposedly never recovered, a convenient excuse that eliminated the need for physical evidence. The photograph proved otherwise. Esther stood in the second row, her face bearing new scars that hadn't been mentioned in any earlier descriptions. The cipher ledger indicated she had been transferred to a plantation in Georgia, where the owner specifically requested an experienced midwife to manage breeding operations. The clinical language couldn't disguise the horror. Esther had been sent to a location where enslaved women were systematically forced into reproduction to increase the owner's human property. Perhaps most disturbing was the case of the Drummond family. Official records showed that Patience Drummond and her 3 children, ages 7, 9, and 12, had all died within a week of each other in February 1856, supposedly from scarlet fever. The plantation doctor Isaiah Thornton had signed death certificates for all 4, but the photograph revealed the truth. All 4 Drummonds appeared in the congregation, very much alive. The cipher ledger explained that the family had been split up and transferred to 3 different locations. Patience went to Mississippi. Her eldest child was sent to Georgia. The 2 younger children disappeared into a plantation in Tennessee. They would never see each other again. Dr. Thornton's medical records, discovered in a courthouse basement in 2021, contained over 50 fraudulent death certificates spanning 2 decades. He had been paid $20 for each certificate, a substantial sum that made him complicit in the systematic erasure of human lives. Capítulo 4. The Silence of Witnesses. The transfer system could not have functioned without the complicity of an entire community. Historians investigating the case discovered that dozens of people, from county clerks to neighboring plantation owners to local ministers, either actively participated in the conspiracy or chose to remain silent about what they witnessed. Church records from St. Augustine's Chapel, where the photograph was taken, revealed troubling patterns. Reverend Thomas Caldwell, who presided over the congregation, kept meticulous records of baptisms, marriages, and deaths. But his death record showed suspicious clustering. Multiple deaths often occurred within days of each other, always with vague causes like fever or sudden illness. Letters discovered in Caldwell's personal correspondence suggested he struggled with his conscience. In an 1857 letter to his brother in Virginia, he wrote, "I am troubled by what I have witnessed here. The Lord tests me daily with knowledge I dare not speak aloud, for fear of what might befall my family and this ministry." He never specified what he knew, but the timing aligned perfectly with the transfer system's peak operations. Local merchants who sold supplies to the plantation network would have noticed the discrepancies. Provisions purchased for populations that supposedly didn't exist. Regular nighttime shipments of cargo transported in closed wagons, yet no one filed complaints or reported suspicions to authorities. The county clerk who processed the death certificates, Benjamin Hargrove, left behind a journal discovered in his descendant's attic in 2019. One entry from 1853 revealed his awareness. Filed another group of certificates today from Dr. Thornton. The numbers don't match what I know of the Whitfield population, but what am I to do? Challenge a respected physician and prominent landowner. My family depends on my position. This culture of complicit silence extended beyond the immediate conspirators. Neighboring plantation owners who weren't part of the network must have noticed the sudden disappearances and impossible death tolls. Yet no contemporary accounts mention any investigations or concerns raised with authorities. The silence was enforced through a combination of economic dependence, social pressure, and fear. Anyone who spoke out risked social ostracism, economic ruin, or worse. The few who did try to intervene found themselves facing legal harassment or threats. One notable exception was documented in court records from 1859. A traveling Methodist minister named Jacob Whitmore visited the region and noticed discrepancies between plantation populations and church membership rolls. He began asking questions and writing letters to abolition societies in the North. Within 3 months, Whitmore was arrested on fabricated charges of theft, tried in a closed proceeding, and sentenced to 6 months in jail. Upon his release, he left Alabama and never returned. His letters to abolition societies were confiscated and destroyed. Only fragments survived, discovered in 2020 in a Massachusetts Historical Society archive. Capítulo 5. The infrastructure of erasure. The transfer system required sophisticated logistics and careful coordination. Documents discovered across multiple state archives revealed the operational mechanics of how human beings were systematically erased from existence and transported across state lines. The network used coded language in correspondence. Enslaved people were referred to as livestock or property units. Transfers were called relocations or estate adjustments. Death certificates were documentation procedures. This linguistic camouflage allowed the conspirators to discuss their operations in seemingly legitimate business terms. Transportation occurred primarily at night, using routes that avoided major towns and checkpoints. The cipher ledger contained detailed maps showing back roads, river crossings, and safe houses where the transferred individuals could be hidden during multi-day journeys. These maps were remarkably sophisticated, noting which counties had sympathetic sheriffs and which roads were patrolled by authorities who might ask questions. Forged documentation extended beyond death certificates. The network produced fake bills of sale, backdated purchase records, and altered census documents. When enslaved people arrived at their new locations, they were given manufactured histories, false names, false ages, and fabricated origins designed to make their previous identities untraceable. Some transfers involved particularly cruel psychological manipulation. Family members who asked about disappeared loved ones were sometimes shown fabricated graves, complete with carved wooden markers. In one documented case, a woman named Ruth Washington spent years visiting what she believed was her husband's burial site, never knowing he was alive 300 miles away on a plantation in Mississippi. The financial records were equally revealing. The transfer system was highly profitable. Plantations that received transferred individuals paid reduced prices compared to market rates for enslaved people purchased through legitimate means. The difference represented the value of having workers who officially didn't exist, people who could be exploited without legal limits or oversight. Marcus Whitfield's accounts showed he charged between $300 and $600 per person for transfers, depending on age and skill level. Over 20 years, the network moved at least 400 people and generated profits equivalent to several $million in modern currency. Capítulo 6. The Children Who Never Were. If this story has already gripped you, leave a like. It helps the story of the Phantom Congregation reach more people. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the transfer system was its impact on children. Of the 127 documented transfers in Marcus Whitfield's cipher ledger, 38 involved children under the age of 12, many separated permanently from their parents. The photograph contains at least 7 children whose official records claimed they had died years earlier. Their faces, captured in that frozen moment, reveal the psychological toll. Expressions of confusion, fear, and a haunted wariness beyond their years. Court documents discovered in 2022 revealed that some children were specifically transferred to locations far from their families to prevent future recognition. One letter from a network member in Georgia to Marcus Whitfield stated bluntly, "Send the youngest children first. They forget quickly and cause less trouble at the new location." Historians found evidence that children declared dead were sometimes told their parents had abandoned them or died. This psychological manipulation served to break family bonds and create compliant workers who believed they had no one to return to. The case of the Morrison children particularly struck the research team. Official records showed that twin boys, Daniel and Isaiah Morrison, died in a barn fire in 1851 at age 5. Their mother, Rebecca Morrison, was recorded as dying from grief 2 weeks later. The photograph proved all three were alive in 1856. The cipher ledger revealed the twins had been transferred to separate plantations, one in Mississippi, one in Alabama, specifically to prevent them from ever reuniting. Rebecca had been transferred to a third location in Georgia. She would never know her sons survived. The boys would grow up believing their mother and twin had perished. Some children in the transfer system were deliberately registered at younger ages than their actual years, extending the period during which they could be exploited for labor before potentially aging out of prime working years. A 13-year-old might be registered as 9, effectively stealing years from their already stolen lives. The psychological impact extended across generations. Descendants of transfer system victims, interviewed as part of the ongoing research, described family histories marked by mysterious gaps, unexplained disappearances, and stories that never quite added up. Many families maintained oral traditions about relatives who vanished or died under suspicious circumstances, but lacked documentation to prove what happened. Capítulo 7. The network unravels. The transfer system operated with impunity from approximately 1842 until the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. But even before the war disrupted plantation operations, cracks were beginning to appear in the conspiracy. The first major exposure came not from abolitionists or legal authorities, but from within the network itself. In 1858, plantation owner Robert Caldwell in Mississippi had a falling out with Marcus Whitfield over financial disputes. Caldwell threatened to expose the transfer system if Whitfield didn't pay what Caldwell claimed he was owed for several transfers. Whitfield's private correspondence from this period, discovered in a sealed trunk in 2020, revealed his panic. In a letter to another network member, he wrote, "Caldwell has become a liability. He speaks carelessly when drunk and makes threats he may not be able to contain. We must consider remedies." 3 months later, Robert Caldwell died in what was officially ruled a hunting accident. Contemporary newspaper accounts described how he had apparently shot himself while crossing a fence. The investigating sheriff was a close associate of the Whitfield family. Whether Caldwell's death was truly accidental remains unproven, but his threat to expose the network died with him. However, his widow discovered some of his papers and, in grief and anger, sent copies to abolition societies in the North. These documents didn't reach authorities before the Civil War intervened, but they survived in archive collections and provided crucial corroboration when historians began their investigation 160 years later. The Civil War's outbreak in 1861 effectively ended the transfer system's operations. As Union forces advanced into the South, plantation records were hastily destroyed to prevent evidence from falling into enemy hands. Marcus Whitfield burned most of his documents in 1864 as Union troops approached. Only the cipher ledger survived, hidden in a sealed compartment in his office desk that his descendants discovered decades later without understanding its significance. After the war, the collapse of the slave economy and the chaos of Reconstruction meant that thousands of separated families tried desperately to reunite. Newspapers ran advertisements from formerly enslaved people searching for lost relatives. The Freedmen's Bureau attempted to help facilitate family reunifications, but the scale of the task was overwhelming. For victims of the transfer system, reunification was nearly impossible. Their official deaths meant they had no legal existence to reclaim. Many victims who tried to return to their original plantations to find family members were told those relatives had died or moved away, sometimes truthfully, often as continued cover-ups. Capítulo 8. The Long Search for Truth. For over 150 years, the truth about the Phantom Congregation remained hidden. The photograph itself passed through several generations of the Whitfield family, its significance unknown to descendants who viewed it simply as a historical curiosity about their ancestors' ministry to slaves. Today, the first hints that something was wrong emerged in the 1970s, when genealogists working on family trees for descendants of enslaved people began noticing impossible patterns in death records. Too many people seemed to die at convenient moments, leaving no bodies and no witnesses, but without physical evidence or documentation beyond suspicious death certificates. These anomalies remained unexplained mysteries. The breakthrough came only with the digitization of historical records and the development of sophisticated database analysis tools. Dr. Okonkwo's 2018 discovery of the photograph was the key that unlocked decades of research. Once historians knew what to look for, they began finding corroborating evidence across multiple archives. The cipher ledger, donated to Alabama State Archives in 2019 by a Whitfield descendant who had found it while renovating an old family home, provided the definitive proof. Its decryption revealed not just the transfer system's mechanics, but also specific names, dates, and locations that could be cross-referenced with other documents. DNA analysis added another layer of evidence. In 2021, researchers began collecting DNA samples from descendants of people who appeared in plantation records. The results revealed family connections that contradicted official histories. People supposedly buried in Alabama had descendants living in Mississippi and Georgia, genetic proof of transfers that were never officially recorded. One particularly moving discovery involved the descendants of Samuel Booker, the literate man who was declared dead in 1848. DNA testing revealed his living descendants in Mississippi, people who had always known their ancestor as Moses Carter, and had no idea of his original identity. When researchers shared the discovery, family members experienced a profound sense of restoration, a stolen identity recovered after 170 years. The investigation expanded internationally when researchers discovered that some individuals in the transfer system may have been illegally transported to Cuba and Brazil in the 1850s, when the Atlantic slave trade was supposedly suppressed. Bank records from New Orleans suggested some network members were involved in international trafficking, though conclusive evidence remains elusive. Capítulo 9. The Weight of Memory. Subscribe to the channel to discover more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of the Phantom Congregation. See you in the next video. The investigation into the Phantom Congregation continues. As of 2025, researchers have identified 127 confirmed victims of the transfer system, with evidence suggesting hundreds more may have been affected. Each discovery brings both revelation and grief, answers for some families, confirmation of losses for others. The photograph itself now resides in a climate-controlled vault, at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of African American History and Culture, recognized as one of the most significant documentary evidences of slavery's hidden atrocities. Visitors stand before it in silence, confronted by 89 faces that refuse to be erased from history. Legal scholars have examined whether any form of justice or reparations might be possible for descendants of transfer system victims. The legal challenges are immense. The perpetrators are long dead. The institutions that enabled the system no longer exist in their original forms, and establishing direct lineage after multiple generations presents enormous difficulties. Yet the moral imperative remains. Community organizations in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia have erected memorials acknowledging the transfer system's victims. Some churches have issued formal apologies for their ancestors' complicity. Descendant groups have formed, creating networks of support and shared history. The story has prompted broader examination of how many similar conspiracies might have operated across the South, leaving no photographic evidence behind. Historians now routinely analyze death records for suspicious patterns, searching for other networks that might have systematically erased enslaved people from official existence. For the descendants who have learned their ancestors' true stories, the revelation brings complex emotions. There is grief for the losses, anger at the injustices, but also profound respect for the resilience of people who survived impossible circumstances. Many describe feeling more connected to their heritage, having recovered identities that were deliberately stolen. The Phantom Congregation stands as testimony to a truth that authorities tried to bury, that even in death, especially in fraudulent death, enslaved people resisted erasure. Their faces, frozen in that 1856 photograph, bear witness across centuries. They demand to be seen, to be remembered, to be acknowledged as individuals with names and families and lives that mattered. The photograph that Marcus Whitfield commissioned as evidence of his Christian ministry became instead evidence of his crimes. The congregation he staged to demonstrate his piety revealed his cruelty. The document meant to glorify the system exposed its fundamental evil, and perhaps most importantly, the 89 faces in that photograph, including the 17 who are officially dead, proved that truth has a way of surviving, even when buried under decades of lies and silence. Memory persists, evidence endures, and eventually, despite every effort to erase them, the dead find ways to speak. The Phantom Congregation waits still in that frozen moment of 1856, bearing witness to what was and demanding acknowledgement of what should never have been. Some truths refuse to stay buried. They wait in silence until someone finally has the courage to look.